BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Tuesday, and on Tuesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about the disappearance of Maura Murray from 2004. And in this episode, I will be continuing the responses to Dr. Phil's Into Thin Air podcast about the disappearance of Maura Murray. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Maura Murray. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. Dr. Phil has been releasing a series of podcasts under his Into Thin Air title, as opposed to one of his other programs, and I had the opportunity to listen to parts 3 and 4. I've done direct responses to parts 1 and 2 here on Black Box Online Radio, but if you haven't heard those, that's fine, you can keep listening. I always want people to just jump right into the subject material so we can talk about the true crime cases, or in this case, a missing persons case. And Maura Murray went missing on February 9th of 2004 after crashing her car into a snowbank in Haverhill, New Hampshire. And in the first two segments, Dr. Phil was sharing a lot of information, but he did it in a very odd way where he's almost making it sound like he believes a particular theory, but he was really just outlining an existing possibility. For example, in part 1, he made a very, very compelling case that Maura Murray went missing because she simply was disoriented, she went down the road and entered the woods voluntarily, and she succumbed to the elements. I mean, it sounded like he was bringing up a lot of solid points. In part 2, he made a very solid case for an abduction, stating that there are all of these points in favor of Maura Murray being abducted after the car crash on Route 112. And parts 3 and 4 had theories all the same. And part 3 was more or less looking at the possibility of law enforcement being involved, some type of police cover-up, or that somebody who was a member of law enforcement was directly responsible for Maura's disappearance. And yes, you could definitely tell he was being careful and not trying to say those words directly, not trying to accuse any specific person. But that was the basic rundown of the episode, and I think it would be so much more valuable to anybody's presentation, whether it's a famous person like Dr. Phil, or it's a YouTube channel like this one that has, a small amount of subscribers, if people tell you what they genuinely think. Because one thing that I like to do on Black Box Online Radio is, I want to be clear that I'm just outlining a theory. Okay, this is a widely discussed possibility versus, yeah, this is a widely discussed possibility, but it's also what I personally think happened in this scenario. And Dr. Phil didn't do that in his Into Thin Air podcast series. He's just listing everything off, but he makes it sound like he believes it. And these different episodes really were just meant to organize things into the accidental death, abduction theory by a random passerby, and the third one could count as an abduction, but it would be the theory that law enforcement was involved. Now, I first learned about the disappearance of Maura Murray in 2015 because of a channel called Lorden Arts, which is hosted by John Lorden, and he did a 2-part episode series on the disappearance of Maura Murray, and he recommended the Maura Murray podcast, and I went down the rabbit hole and I got pulled in. And one of the most memorable episodes of Missing Maura Murray was called The Red Truck, the Rusty Knife, in the A-Frame House. And it tells the story of how there was a suspicious vehicle in the area that could have been following Maura. This could have been a tandem driver, or it could be just someone who was eyeing her down. There was also a knife that was found and turned over to from somebody, claiming that it may have relevance to the crime. And the A-Frame House was more or less what some people would call a cabin in the woods, or maybe some people would think it's more advanced than that, and there was blood that was on the carpet of the closet, or the floor of the closet in the A-Frame House. And Dr. Phil was using part 3 of his series to talk about the A-frame house in a reasonable amount of detail. Not extraordinary detail, but a reasonable amount. And he's saying that somebody came forward and said that his brother might have been involved in the disappearance of Maura Murray. And he contacted Fred Murray, Maura's father, and shared this information. He also produced a knife that was turned over to law enforcement, and it was analyzed, but no response was ever made. The man who came forward was not publicly identified, and also the knife was not conclusively revealed to the public as to whether or not it actually had Maura's blood on it, whether or not it had human blood on it, whether or not it had blood from a deer or another animal, and that mostly ended in a standstill. But that is one of the most memorable aspects of the Missing Maura Murray podcast, because I particularly remember that there were 3 clues that were discussed: the red truck, the rusty knife, and the A-frame house. And my immediate takeaway was that the red truck sounded like it was the most important of these clues. And this was something that Dr. Phil didn't quite agree with, or he didn't choose to share on his podcast, Into Thin Air. And in part 4, he had the opportunity to bring on a member of law enforcement named John Schell, and that gives us the namesake for today's episode. We're looking at the opinions of law enforcement, and he is someone who spent 30 years with the NYPD, a high-ranking individual with them, and he analyzed the information and offered his interpretation of the evidence. And they both were just absolutely centered on the knife in the A-frame house, saying that this is going to be the foundation of everything. This is the biggest lead in the case, that there's this A-frame house that had blood on the floor in a closet shortly after Maura's disappearance, and someone came forward with this information. Well, what do we make of this A-frame house clue with the knife in question? In part 3, Dr. Phil made a very bold statement, saying that he had some particular problems with the individual that came forward. This person said he may have had information about the disappearance of Maura Murray. He might have known who was responsible for the disappearance of Maura Murray. He might have possibly known something about a knife that could have been used in the murder of Maura Murray. And Dr. Phil's like, well, what do you mean you may have this information? You might know something. What do you mean this could have possibly been involved in her murder? Like, how specific are you? How much do you actually know? How precise can you be? Because ultimately, what I think Dr. Phil is saying is that person had a suspicion. That person had an inclination, an inkling. They had some cause for concern. But that's not hard evidence. And I was really surprised that John Schell, this member of the NYPD, was just saying if he could do anything, he would go back to the A-frame house and say that the A-frame house is most likely going to be the foundation of the search. Yes, of course you should explore this, because you should explore all leads. Of course you should look into this, because you should look into everything. Leave no stone unturned. But I'm not optimistic about the A-frame house or the knife. I think that this is just somebody who had a hunch or they had a suspicion about a particular individual. They came forward, and law enforcement had the knife. I mean, the forensic scientists had the knife from the best of my understanding, which would mean that they didn't find anything. Or let's rephrase that. If something comes back negative, members of law enforcement do not always make an announcement over every negative finding. It's quite possible that this knife was purely unrelated. Now, the explanation provided as to why there was blood on a knife and on the floor of the A-frame house was that it was a hunting cabin. And, they're dealing with a lot of animals and carcasses and so on. But Dr. Phil brought up a very particular question. If that's true, why would the blood be found in the closet? If someone were dressing a deer or trying to slaughter a deer, even in a hunting cabin, why would the blood be found in the closet? My simple response is, okay, I completely agree with you, Dr. Phil. I completely understand what you're saying. I completely grasp it. I mean, yes, that's an abnormal place to slaughter a deer, right? Although, some people might hang a deer upside down. I mean, you don't normally do that in a closet. You typically do that outside. But what is so much more likely is an object that came into contact with blood could be placed in the closet. And some people would do this, whether it's bloody clothes, or maybe a tray or a bowl or something that came in contact with the blood would be put in the closet, because some people simply want to be out of sight and out of mind. If something is bloody, they want to move it to a place where they aren't looking at it, or they just think that it's dirty, and they're going to put it out of sight, especially bloody clothes. Now that begs the question of how much blood are we talking about, because even clothes that are soaked in deer blood might be very different than if you were to actually slaughter an animal. That would be considerably larger. But if you're going to talk about just finding blood in the closet of a hunting cabin, I'm not shocked about that. I've already told you guys, I'm not optimistic about this lead using the A-frame house. Of course you should look into it, because it could lead to something, but you have to sort of try and evaluate the information and determine what most likely happened to Maura. Now, I told you guys that there were parts 3 and 4 of the Into Thin Air podcast that have been released. Part 3 was about 46 minutes long, and part 4 was about 1 hour and 8 minutes long. And I decided to respond to both of them because I was thinking that part 3 is going to be very short. I'm probably not going to find a lot of information there, but I was completely wrong. It was in reverse. The 46-minute episode with Dr. Phil was so much more valuable than the 1 hour and 8 minute interview with John Schell from the NYPD, because in the 46-minute interview, or the 46-minute presentation of part 3, Dr. Phil just laid it out. He just gave us the points, he gave us the discussion material, he just gave us the analysis, and that's what I was looking for. Not a bunch of twisted and convoluted questions that are just supported by so many forms of mental conjecture, or people saying, I'm not really sure as an answer to everything. In the 46-minute episode, part 3, Dr. Phil just gave us the challenge questions, the points to explore, and the things to consider. And that's mostly what I'm looking for when I'm following an unsolved mystery. And as I said, every Tuesday I talk about the disappearance of Maura Murray, and you can always hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these discussions. You can also listen to other content here on BBOR, talking about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper. But in terms of Maura Murray's disappearance, in part 3, Dr. Phil was trying to go against the tandem driver theory. He's already talked about the possibility that Maura was taken to an A-frame house and she was murdered, but the tandem driver theory is one that he has mentioned in the first 3 parts of his episode, saying that it's possible that Maura went to meet somebody, she had a plan to go out into the woods, and she was going to spend a week in somebody's cabin, a week in a motel room with somebody, but we don't know who that person was. Then Maura's car goes off the road, and Maura is never seen or heard from again. The issues with the tandem driver theory that they brought up is, some people think that Maura was trying to escape, to start a new life. That she was trying to go away because either she had done something bad or she was frustrated with the nursing program at her university, UMass Amherst. And Dr. Phil pointed out that it doesn't really seem like Maura's trying to disappear. She only took out $280 from her bank account. That's not enough to start a new life. I disagree completely. Dr. Phil was also saying that Maura has never used her cell phone. She's never tried to access her bank account. She never used anything under her name. Her passport was never used. That doesn't sound like someone who's trying to start a new life. I disagree completely. Dr. Phil was saying that even the best witness protection programs in the United States can't do something that clean. I disagree completely, and I am shocked that a person as famous as Dr. Phil would say that. He might be the most famous TV psychologist in the world, and he's going to say that type of nonsense. How could somebody start a new life with $280? They could have someone helping them. How could somebody disappear without using their cell phone, credit card, passport, and all of that? Because they're not stupid, and that's just it. That's just it. If Maura was actually leaving the scene of the accident to start a new life, in almost every single variant of that theory is that she was picked up by somebody else, and she was taken away, and that person would have provided for her food, money, clothes, and even A fool would know that if you're going to use your cell phone, they can track your location. Even a fool would know that if you use electronic banking, people are going to track your electronic banking. So what would somebody do? They wouldn't use those things. And do I support the tandem driver theory? No. I've told you guys very clearly during this Maura Murray segment that that's not my theory. That's not a go-to theory for me. I don't agree with it. But the explanations that Dr. Phil provided as a rebuttal to the tandem driver theory and Maura starting a new life are simply incorrect, in my unprofessional opinion. And furthermore, I'll even state it as a fact. Everything that he has put forward is just factually incorrect. That yes, you can run away with $280 if you have somebody else who is giving you money and support and brings you to a place to live. And we also have to remember that in 2004, you didn't need a passport to cross the Canadian border. I've told this story many times, so I'll be very brief. I crossed the border in 2006. We went to a conference with my university. We just used our university IDs. They weren't even things like a driver's license. It could have been done at the time, but I don't really think that that's what happened to Maura. That would be a case of me outlining the theory, as opposed to proposing one that I genuinely believe. Now, the theories that were more favorably held in Part 3 was the possibility of Maura being abducted and transported by a member of law enforcement. Maura would have gone off the road, and then a bus driver comes over named Butch Atwood, and he's telling her, hey, do you need help? And she said she didn't need assistance because she had already called AAA, and that someone was coming to help her. Butch knew that this was a lie because there was no cell service in the area, so what he decided to do was go back home and tell his wife, Barbara, that this girl has just had an accident. She's off the road. She seems a little bit shaken up. And that Barbara Atwood is the one who calls 911, and at least one other person in the area also called 911. And then this brought the responding officer, Cecil Smith, who drove in a red Ford Explorer to find Maura. Cecil Smith was the first person to respond. Now, one point that was heavily discussed in this set of podcasts, episodes 3 and 4, was that did Butch Atwood do something malicious? Is there some reason to suspect him? I mean, he was the last person to have seen Maura alive. He was the last person to have seen anything to do with Maura. He was the last person to see her by her car in the official reports. And some people were talking in the comments section about how Butch Atwood said he never let Maura out of his sight. He knew where she was, so it wouldn't make sense that she would disappear, and he wouldn't be able to see that because he said the crash site was always in his vantage point. And I'm like, I don't actually think Butch Atwood said that, first of all. Secondarily, that would be impossible. Butch Atwood was driving a school bus, and he drove back to his home. And he's going to be parking a school bus, as well as talking to his wife, going back into his school bus to do paperwork. I mean, that's what I remember off of memory, that Butch Atwood walked out of the school bus, and then he told his wife while he was standing in the house. Then he went back into the school bus to do paperwork, which was part of his routine. And then at that point, Butch is just heading on to continue on with his daily evening activities, and he didn't see Maura the entire time. Even if you mean that he could have kept an eye on her for a little bit, it wouldn't be the entirety of the events. There's no possible way he could have been focused on the crash site for the entire time that it took Cecil Smith to respond. Now, I just told you that Cecil Smith was reportedly driving a red Ford Explorer, and some people were wondering, well, why would he be in a car like that? Why wouldn't he be in a police cruiser? And the answer that was provided on the Dr. Phil podcast was, this was a vehicle that was used for the snow. When it was snowy out in New Hampshire, they were going to be driving an SUV as opposed to a typical police cruiser. And some people were making the connection that this was the suspicious red truck that had been following Maura, or that had been seen in Maura's vicinity. Or there's also a report that the red truck had maybe even picked up Maura. And I find that very surprising because, as I said, the most memorable episode of Missing Maura Murray was talking about how the red truck was not an SUV, it wasn't a Ford Explorer, it was just that, a red truck. It was a red pickup truck that either had wood panels or a type of wood barrier in the bed of the pickup truck for additional hauling. And when I recall, when I was thinking about that, like, it stood out so vividly in my memory because of the movie Lethal Weapon 4, where Joe Pesci says that he is a private investigator and he's driving this giant red SUV, and then Mel Gibson tells him, "Oh, that's a very nice, inconspicuous car you got there, Leo." And that was the first thing that came into mind. But they were saying very clearly that the suspicious red truck was a pickup, not a Ford Explorer. So, in terms of this incident with Cecil Smith, I mean, it's something that I am keeping an open mind to. It is not my immediate theory. It is not my absolute go-to theory, but it's something that I believe is worthy of consideration. And I will just mostly leave it at that. There are some ways that people would outline this particular theory, and that is that, number one, Maura had a real car accident. She gets out of the car. She's talking to Butch Atwood. She's thinking that she can solve the problem herself. She starts walking down the road, and this red SUV comes up saying, "Hey, do you need a ride?" And she's like, "No." And he's like, "Hey, I'm a member of law enforcement. Here's my badge. Somebody called and said there was a car wreck. Was that you?" And she's like, "Okay, yes." But then, they start talking, and one thing would lead to another. I would totally be open to that possibility. However, there is another issue with this, and that is that Maura did indeed lose the scent. Like, her scent was lost 100 yards from the crash site. Cecil Smith could have been driving in the opposite direction, and Maura could have been picked up by somebody else. To the credit of John Schell, as a veteran from NYPD and law enforcement, there is also a statement that he was saying where he's like, when somebody's scent is just completely lost, that doesn't mean that they just started doing something different. That means that something interrupted their path or the presence of their scent. And if this were in New York City, that would mean that they got into a car, they got into a taxi, they got on a bus, they got on the subway. If the scent is just lost and the dogs have no idea where it's going. And this would indicate that Maura did indeed get into somebody's vehicle, but that doesn't have to be the responding officer, Cecil Smith. That could be somebody else's car altogether. That could mean that Maura was walking down and some passerby just offered her a ride. She first said no to Butch Atwood. Then, after 100 yards, she realized how cold it was. She realized how bad the situation was. So she accepted the ride, and then that person did something to her. And I don't want to accuse Officer Cecil Smith of doing anything malicious until there is more supporting evidence. And I know that might not be a popular opinion, but that is something that I would like to really fortify. And it seemed like a lot of people in the comment section were heavily open to this possibility of Cecil Smith being involved. But, I mean, we have to remember that we can't only rely on conjecture. We also have to look at the hard evidence. And I would like to look at a comment that came in on last week's episode, which was also responding to part 2 of the Dr. Phil podcast, Into Thin Air. And it comes to us from Steve Lins, who says, "Ned, regarding the tandem driver theory, Maura would have been following another vehicle when she crashed her car, the other vehicle would have continued on ahead for a bit before noticing that she wasn't behind them. Upon realizing that Maura wasn't there, they would have turned around and returned the other way. In the time that it took them to return, Maura would have grabbed a few things from her car and began walking in the direction while she was traveling, eventually meeting up with the other driver, getting picked up approximately 100 yards down the road, thus explaining why the tracker dogs lost her scent. Also, go back and look at the early reporting. Fred Murray, her father, did not believe that Maura had been abducted. He not only made comments to the media about suggesting this, but he feared that she made a squaw walk, but he made a personal plea to Maura to just come back, and whatever the problem was, they could work it out. The suggestion that Fred believed from the beginning that she was abducted is not at all consistent with what he said in the early days following the disappearance. Well, I completely appreciate the comment and the insight and the analysis, but let's say if this was a planned disappearance, and that Maura is following somebody's car, why on earth would she leave the alcohol behind? I mean, how difficult would it be for somebody to just turn around and go back and get the alcohol? Okay, Maura's car goes off the road, and the tandem driver is approximately 100 yards in front of her. When they realize that she's not following them anymore, they pull over to the side. Well, why is she lingering at the crash site if the car that she's supposed to get into is already there and she knows exactly where it is? Why wouldn't she just get out of the car and try to flag them down? That is also a big strike, but I think the alcohol is the bigger clue. Moore left wine coolers behind. She left a box of Franzia wine in the back seat, and maybe she thought the box was damaged, but definitely the wine coolers. And if she was just going to walk 100 yards, she could have taken those with her. And if this person had a drinking problem, which is reported that Maura did indeed have a drinking problem, I just don't think that we would experience that type of evidence. This seems like somebody who crashed her car, she left with the intention of returning. I openly told you, I don't think that Maura was trying to start a new life, although Dr. Phil's explanations as to why were not very strong. Maura would have left the crash site, and she was walking perhaps to the next town, perhaps to find somebody that she felt more comfortable with than Butch Atwood to get assistance, and then ultimately Maura would have just decided to get into somebody's vehicle. As of now, I would be going with the abduction theory as opposed to Maura dying in the woods. But I could be easily persuaded, and I'd also told you guys directly that my go-to theory for a long time was that this was just an accidental death in the woods. But there's another issue, though, that I would like to talk to you guys about, and this relates to it just relates to how law enforcement could have been involved. And I know I've gone through a lot of points, but it's a theory that I thought was absolutely ridiculous when I first heard it, that any member of law enforcement, any cop, had anything to do with this. In one theory that I haven't discussed too much on these recent Maura Murray episodes for the Tuesday show is that Maura could have been involved in a minor accident in New Hampshire. And that's what caused the damage to her car. That's what caused the crack in the windshield. That's what caused the airbag to go off. And this was something that, she experienced at sometime around 5 or 6 p.m. in New Hampshire. And she was actually there for much longer than expected. And then they put her car on the side of the road. Maura could have even had a minor collision with the bus. And then somebody from law enforcement comes. This guy says, hey, my buddy works with the police. He'll just sort this out. We'll just fill out a report. You're not in any trouble. One thing leads to another, and that's the ultimate end game for Maura Murray. And this is something that I also don't like talking about because it's all speculative that Maura got into an accident well before Route 112 and that her car was stashed there. Her car, like the whole accident by the weathered barn, was all staged. And I know that that's way too speculative, and it's not even evidence-based. It's mostly conjecture-based. But it is something that has been proposed, because one of the discoveries of 107 Degrees, or at the very least, I heard it on 107 Degrees, hosted by Aaron Larkin, was that Butch Atwood made a comment that he did not know the responding officer, Cecil Smith, but in reality, he did know Cecil Smith, and they were actually drinking buddies, so why would he lie about something like that? And that is just one thing that came up in the discussions. But during the last episode of the Maura Murray segment that I've done for the Tuesday show, I also looked at the comments section on Dr. Phil's channel to see what people were saying, and these are going to be from Part 3. Once again, I thought Part 3 was absolutely better than Part 4. And we have some comments that people are saying, and most of them are just giving out support to the family, for example, and I'll just read people's initials. JT says, The poor man, Fred Murray, has more right than any law enforcement to his child's case. I would not rest if my child was missing. And what I think this refers to is there was the rusty knife that was found, and the rusty knife, the bloody knife, this knife that could have been involved in Maura's murder. Then they should have given him a direct answer. They should have provided him with the direct results, even if they were negative. But as I told you, law enforcement doesn't always respond to things if they are negative. The second response is from JC, who says, Maura had a DWI accident. Sergeant Smith appeared within minutes. Maura disappeared within those minutes. She would have been extremely cold and ready to be rescued, such as Dr. Phil's hot pavement analogy. In my opinion, the cop arrived, she was cold, got into his car, and Maura begged him to take her somewhere and not report the DUI. He may have had sympathy for her or other intentions, so he took her to a second location. He soon realized that he made a big mistake, and the cops covered it up. Well, again, that's something that's very speculative. How do we know that Officer Cecil Smith took Maura to a different location? I would simply say we don't know that. I know you're trying to provide an explanation about how there's this very small window of time, very small window, when Butch Atwood left Maura and Cecil Smith arrives. It's probably 10 minutes. On the Dr. Phil podcast, they were estimating that it was 10 minutes and change. What this person, JC, is talking about in regards to the hot pavement analogy is, in episode 2, Dr. Phil said, if you were a kid, when you think back to those days, and you were running through the grass on a hot summer day, and you went from the grass into the road, the black pavement of the road, the blacktop of the road, would burn your feet. And if you were running, you couldn't stop immediately. And if you ran out into the center of a 2-lane road, you would have a choice. Do you either go back to where you started to get off the hot road, or do you keep going to the other side to get off the hot road? You have to make a choice. That's the hot pavement analogy. And Maura was in a similar situation. If she crashed her car without any weird police cover-up, she had to make a decision. What do? Do I go back? Do I accept help from Butch Atwood, or do I try to walk to a different place to get assistance? And ultimately, I think Maura was walking to a place to get assistance, and then somebody picked her up and then brought her to a particular place. And this one is from SC that says, the guy that called to report that his brother may have been involved, why he made the call to the dad instead of the police? Absolutely, he should have called the police first. But this also goes to show you that there are questions that people should have about the disappearance of Maura Murray and the actions of law enforcement, the actions of the witnesses, the actions of the responders, because in part 4 of the Dr. Phil podcast, they're even challenging Butch Atwood. They're like, how could Butch Atwood leave a 21-year-old woman on the side of the road when he knew there was no cell service? And I think the simple answer is, he didn't know that she was going to walk away from her car. He was just driving home, and he responded. It's the hot pavement analogy. Do you walk backward or do you walk forward? And it seems like he went forward. And they're also saying things about, like, why didn't law enforcement give a bigger response? Even if you look at some of the clues, that there could have been alcohol spilled, that Maura could have been driving drunk, that maybe she hit her head on the windshield, they should have been like, we need to look out for a 21-year-old woman who might be disoriented. If you're wrong, then you're wrong. And you just say, oh, hey, we thought you needed help, but you didn't. Okay, then. But they really did not give a very powerful response. And I agree completely. And that's ultimately why this case was not solved. Because people underestimated the situation. They misinterpreted the situation. They thought that everything was fine, but in reality, it was not. And I would like to thank everybody for listening to this week's episode of the Maura Murray segment here on Black Box Online Radio. Once again, I talk about this one on the Tuesday show. And one thing that I would like to do in the future is to really get into the media pressure podcast. That was something that I wanted to do from the start because that's the one that's actually done by her family. And Dr. Phil has been putting out these segments of Into Thin Air about the disappearance of Maura Murray. And, it's new content, new analysis, and new commentary about a case that I follow, so of course I wanted to respond to him. But in terms of Maura Murray's case, I think that we're just going to have to keep keep waiting for future developments. And one thing that John Shell said in episode 4 that I think is very, very honest and very true is that this case will be solved by DNA or storytelling. And by storytelling, I think he means a confession. Somebody out there knows something, and then they will be able to provide that information to members of the general public. They will first go to law enforcement, then the public, then the media, perhaps in that order. But DNA or storytelling. If they find physical remains with Maura Murray's DNA, that's entirely possible. Or if they have somebody come forward who actually shares something, maybe somebody knows something about who gave Maura a ride that night. So I'm going to leave you guys with the challenge question. What makes more sense to you? Do you think that Maura Murray entered somebody's vehicle, or do you think that the search dogs just lost her scent and then she ran down the road and entered the woods? So what makes more sense to you? And what do you think about this angle of the abductor being a police officer? Please let me know anything you want to share in the comments section down below. You know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There is also the Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, which I'm starting to use more. And of course, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And I use these pages to release shorts and reels Monday through Friday, mostly talking about serial killers, true crime news, true crime books, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And yes, I talk about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, D.B. Cooper, and the disappearance of Maura Murray here on Black Box Online Radio. And that's all for me now. I'll see you tomorrow for a new episode about Jack the Ripper. And until next time.